Welcome to the Art and Analytics of Negotiation panel today. My name is Soki Chen. I am a first-year MBA student at MIT Sloan. As the student lead of this panel, I'm very excited to introduce to you a distinguished panel of guests that we have here on the stage. Starting from Brian Burke, who needs no introduction, but Brian Burke from Toronto Maple Leafs. We have Gary Gerzog from the National Football League. We have Joel Linsner from the Electronic Arts. We have Kate Massey from the Wharton School of Management. And we have Alex Schneider from the Dallas Cowboys. This panel will be moderated by Shira Springer from the Boston Globe. And we intend to end promptly at 3:20 p.m. this afternoon. We'll leave the last 10 to 15 minutes of this panel for questions from the audience. And if anyone would like to ask any questions, you can text ask2 to the number 37048, or you can also tweet your questions with the hashtag SSAC anytime during this panel. With that, I'll hand it over to Shira.
Thanks, Soki. Thanks for being here, and I'm going to get right to it since our time is relatively short. I thought I'd kick off by asking all of the panelists to share a recent negotiation. I think since the hockey trade line was just this past Monday, we'd start off with Brian Burke. It's my understanding that you had close to 20 deals in the hopper approaching the deadline, yet only one got done. So tell us about the process of negotiating on a trading deadline.
Well, I think, Peter Chiarelli's here from the Bruins. I think he'd concur the trade deadline is a very confusing time for teams because with the three-point system we have now where you get a point for an overtime loss or a shootout loss, you really can't open up a gap on the teams below you in the standings, and it's hard to make up ground. So when you get to the trading deadline like last Monday, there's still so many teams in contention mathematically that there's a real reluctance to be seen as a seller. If you end up selling assets, people think you've quit on your team, and so on. So we, like everyone else, we did all the work. We knew all the players who were in play. We knew all the price tags. What we try to do for the trade deadline, and I'm not a big deadline guy historically, we try and set our prices internally so that you don't get caught up in the moment and say, oh, we got to do that, and you'll end up overpaying. So we set our prices. If we can make these deals at these price tags, at these costs, we'll make them. We had about 20 different deals we were talking about, prospective deals with teams. Not with Boston. We talked about one, Peter and I had one minor league deal going maybe for a minor league player. We ended up not making that. And the only deal we made, we think it's an important deal. We traded for a kid named Ashton Carter, or Carter Ashton, I get his name backwards. His dad's a former NHL player. Carter Ashton is a big forward who can skate, was playing in the Tampa Bay Lightning American League affiliate. We traded a big defenseman who can skate for him. We need some forwards with size. We think this kid will be on our team next year. But the defenseman we traded away is a real good young player too. So we think it was an important deal. It's going to help both teams, but no immediate impact.
Just going to say generally to all the panelists, whoever wants to answer this, trading deadlines, are they helpful to doing business, or are they sometimes a hindrance? How do you feel about having a deadline when you have, to get a deal done?
I think from our perspective, we find deadlines to be very helpful. We have an approval process with our owners, either through committees or a three-quarter membership vote of all the NFL owners. And when we're negotiating with business partners, we tell them what our process is, and we oftentimes find that we don't really get serious with the other party until several days before that deadline, and then it brings both sides together. We may be 80, 75%, but the remaining 20, 25% gets done very quickly, and people move off of their positions. There are instances where the deadline is not necessarily the contract expiration. We're increasingly finding that with many of the people we do business with, they need to know whether they're going to be renewing with us a year, 18 months, or sometimes 2 years in advance of the contract expiration. I've negotiated for years with Joe Linsner on my left, Electronic Arts. When you're creating complex software, that's not something you could start and have to the market 2 months. You need to invest those resources, and we really view a deadline as the true deadline as being very different from the contract deadline.
I was going to say, switching gears a little bit, Joel, with you, if you could talk about the deal you did recently with Manchester City.
Yeah, the Manchester City Football Club, which incidentally is at the top of the table in the Premier League as we speak. All negotiations turn on what each party brings to the table and also what each party hopes to take away from the table. And with Electronic Arts, I tell a lot of our partners, Gary's heard this many times, is that we can do things for our commercial partners that, and other video game companies can as well. I don't mean to just single out Electronic Arts, but we can do things that no other commercial partner can really do. And in this particular instance, we brought our digital assets and our game engines and our connected community and our marketing platform, and we could bring that to Manchester City in a way to promote their brands and extend their reach and help the popularity of their players and just bring content, unique content, to their fan clubs, so that we were able to negotiate a sponsorship deal, of which many people here have done sponsorship deals, but it was a unique combination of something that we can bring that other partners couldn't, and that what they were looking for, that was something other than money, which is what most sponsorship deals turn on. And it was really refreshing, and I think it hopefully will be a precedent for more deals of that type for my company.
And now, Gary and Alec, you've had an interesting circumstance. You negotiated a merchandise deal. It's my understanding the Cowboys are the first and last or first and only team to warehouse, distribute, and manufacture their own merchandise. And I also understand, and I'd like you to talk about this, it was a deal that for 8 years was basically a handshake deal with nothing signed.
That was Gary's fault.
I disagree.
Yeah, and it goes to what Joel said, which is that I think you have to understand what you want first in a negotiation. Then you need to understand what the other party wants. And those things don't have to always butt up against each other. And the Dallas Cowboys were the first team to opt out of the league merchandising deal. So we get to manufacture, distribute, warehouse our own goods. It's a complicated deal because we have the league licensing partner, Reebok and now Nike. And then, of course, we have the 31 other clubs. And we had to buy our way out of the deal. And as you can imagine, that can get pretty complicated. How much do you pay for what you might consider to be your own rights? And throw in the fact that you'll always be there with NFL. So you can't have too contentious a negotiation, but you do want to get the deal as favorable as possible for you. And Gary and I started on the deal about 12 years ago. We just worked on a renewal of the deal about 2 years ago, and I like to think that there's another important element of these negotiations, which is we've grown to trust each other. And so we know that if he says to me, look, this isn't going to fly with the 31 other clubs, I take that to heart, and we try to figure out another way around it.
What I would add to that deal is, while we didn't have a signed deal for 7 or 8 years, we were operating under 30, 40 pages that had been agreed to, and there were probably 4 or 5 open points. No one wanted to budge. Everyone was called, it was the fear of the unknown. I don't want to agree to this because I don't know what's going to happen. And we assumed there would become a point in time at the NFL that there would be some impetus to get it done, and it turned out we had not been able to resolve the original agreement what happens when the Cowboys make the playoffs and they want to use the NFL Shield, divisional marks that are owned by the league on the merchandise. And sure enough, the Cowboys made the playoffs that year, and it brought us together, and we very quickly got focused, and there would have been a significant amount of money lost on both sides, and we figured it out.
I guess to Kate, what do you see here? What have you heard, and what do you know from what you've studied that allows deals to be successful? I mean, what are sort of the key ingredients to successful deal making?
Well, something I'm hearing so far is a focus on what the other side is interested in. A lot of my students, when they first come into negotiation, focus on or obsessed with what they need, what they want, what their priorities are. And then the more sophisticated you are as a negotiator, the more you focus on what the other side wants. When I first started teaching negotiation, I decided I should go ask a bunch of folks who negotiate for a living. First person I asked was my father, who practiced law for 50 years. And he told me about a business partner of his who had died in the 80s. But he had been a trader all his life. He was a trader, cattle trader, farms, ranches. He died a very wealthy man. And his office was just a phone and an ashtray. And he said that his motto, what he thought was key, was figuring out what the other party needs, or better, figuring out what they want. And if you can do that, you can get just about anything from them. And I think that you see the novice negotiators start out only focused on what they want, good negotiators focus more on what the other party wants.
Interesting. I wanted to shift a little bit to analytics because this is an analytics conference. And I guess to Brian, how much do you use analytics in your negotiations with players and agents? And particularly, for example, if you have, let's say, a 30-year-old center, and all the analytics, all the statistics tell you that he's on the downside of his career. Is this something you're frank with him about? Is it something you're frank with the agent about?
Yes, the analytics, like if you go with our players when they turn pro, they're in the entry-level system typically for 3 years. Then they come out and they're a Group 2 free agent with a team right to match. And then where they've got the true leverage is when they get to Group 3 and they're unrestricted. In those first 2 phases, the negotiation focuses on historical, traditional data. Time on ice, penalty minutes, goals, assists, face-offs, the normal stuff that you'd see in the Boston Globe, for example. But we do, the analytics on older players are very telling, and there are notable exceptions, but that is a factor in everything we do. So we signed Tim Connolly, for example, this past summer as an unrestricted free agent. He's an older player who's had some injury issues. We only signed him for 2 years. The agent wanted a number of teams that offered him 3- and 4-year deals. We said we're only comfortable going that long in terms of his age and his injury history. He had some various injuries. It wasn't one bad shoulder. It's like a medical textbook. He had like 5 different things that kept him out of games. So we do it at that stage. From our perspective, we have not, and I asked Peter to correct me, but I think he agrees with me, we have not seen a system of analytics that would change the way we look at things, no Moneyball revelation type thing. I think baseball particularly lends itself to statistical analysis. Our games are more a series of random events. It's not a guy standing at the plate facing so many pitches and versus lefties versus righties. These guys are in different situations. They improvise a lot, and so we have not seen, and as I said in my earlier panel, it's not for lack of trying. I must get 30 of these a year with grad students who say, I've come up with a new system, and like I said earlier, I don't read the goddamn things, but somebody does. We want to make sure there's not an edge in there. If someone's going to find that edge and share it with us, we want to be on top of it, just like we're on top of any medical advances or any training advances. We want to be an innovator. So we read them, but we haven't seen one yet where we say we've got to start, preparing for the draft or negotiating player contracts differently on the basis of this statistical analysis that we've overlooked to this point.
Anybody else want to chime in into how analytics has either changed or been an increased presence in negotiations?
Chime in. The years I spent at the NFL, when I first got there, the standard practice for the most part was to open up the contract, look at what someone was paying, and try to figure out, what's a good percentage increase? How's the economy doing? How's that business partner doing? And that's changed significantly in the last, I'd say, 7 to 10 years. On every negotiation we have, we're trying to figure out the value that we provide to the third party, the direct value, the indirect value. Has the NFL rights been able to influence their stock price? If you look at, what was DirecTV in 1994 before we provided them exclusive rights to Sunday Ticket. We think there's many instances where the NFL has really helped taking companies to the next level. So we find that we're sitting across the table, we're dealing with sophisticated financial models, we're having good, healthy discussions about whether our assumptions are correct. I've had those discussions with Joel when we had the negotiations with Alec most recently. We were looking at 8 or 9 years of financials on the Cowboys apparel business and trying to figure out what was the right amount of money that the Cowboys should pay the other 31 owners, to Alec's point, to secure those rights for the next 5 years. So I think the dynamic has really changed. It's no longer about, this is the standard royalty rate for a particular category.
Now, Joe, you have an interesting situation because it can be sometimes the value people place on your products can be different. I know you've shown me a survey from the University of Oregon where it said that people who played Madden NFL had a 60% higher football IQ, and you see that as a value added for the NFL. I'd like to hear both the NFL's perspective on whether that's a value added and your contention as to why that's a value added.
I've been at Electronic Arts since 1999, and anecdotally, anybody that has spent any time with EA Sports products has heard about kids who learned the names of all the basketball teams by playing our NBA Live game or the rules of football by playing Madden. And at the University of Oregon, they actually studied it. They did a survey of Madden football players versus football fans and former players. So they weren't just taking random public. And they found that the Madden players not only were 60% smarter in terms of knowing the rules and the strategies of professional football, but that the percentage increase goes up with the length of time you played the game, which was consistent with again, the data. In just the current series of games that we have, which our year begins in April 1st. So for the games that we've launched since April 1st of this year, we have hosted 1.8 billion online game sessions. So people play these games a lot. It's no surprise that they learn the rules, they learn the players, they learn the teams, they learn the logos, and they learn the history frequently as well. And what we think is, as I said before, when we were talking about Man City, we bring something to the table that a lot of other partners can't bring, and we're always hoping that that will play a part in the negotiations we have with partners like the NFL or the NBA.
Does it?
It plays a part. I've heard Joel's speech before.
How much?
No, in all seriousness, we do appreciate what EA does. It's been a terrific product for our fans. I know from my own market research, having a son growing up playing the game, he certainly learned a lot through that, and it does make sense intuitively. We do take it into account, probably not in negotiation, probably not to the extent that Joel and other senior management at EA would like, but it is important.
I keep trying to get him to pay us, but that hasn't worked yet.
So we've talked about, I guess, deals from them succeeding, but what in your experience has blown up a deal? I mean, what causes a deal to, at the last minute come off the table or something like that? And maybe Alec, I don't know if you had those type of experiences, but
What are you
Implying.
suggesting here? Why me? I think that you need to keep emotion out of it as much as possible. And I think there are times in any complicated negotiation where you'll be upset with the other party, and you have to put it to the side and realize that you're there to get the deal done. If it's a good deal, you're there to get it done. And you can't get hung up on certain parts of the deal. Figure out a way around those parts, be mentally agile, and avoid getting tripped up by what other people say and focus on your job. And what I've seen is that in really complicated transactions, emotions will at some point get high, and someone will say, this is a deal breaker for me. You hear that a lot, or this is my walkaway point. And I find that it usually isn't. And if you're the one who can just say, okay, well, what about this, or what about that, then you can usually reset things. The deals that collapse are either bad deals, which is good, that they went away, or deals where one side just decided that they couldn't get over the emotions of the deal. And kind of one example we had, and this is not a deal that collapsed, but the city of Arlington, when we negotiated that deal, obviously it was a high-profile deal, and tensions were high at various points. And I remember that my colleague on the other side of the table, every day when we negotiated, he said, look, if the Cowboys want to go to Los Angeles, let them go to Los Angeles. And I remember thinking every day, why is he saying this? We're obviously not going to Los Angeles. And his real point was, what we care about is the Cowboys being here. And that's the key part of the deal for the city of Arlington. And so there should be no holes in that part of the deal. So I stopped worrying about ways that if thunder struck and there was tornadoes, that we could move to a different city. I said, you know what, this is what they care about. And we got beyond it, and then the rest of the negotiation was relatively easy.
Follow up on that, though. As a result of giving him that, you say the rest of the negotiation was easy, and you were able to get a lot back because you were able to identify what he most needed. And that didn't matter to you that much. And if you could give that to him, then you're able to pull something over here, right?
That's right. And we, of course, what we value, and this is just kind of the Cowboys way, what we valued was to get as much upside as possible, to have no constraints on our ability to drive revenue. Mm-hmm. They valued security. Mm-hmm. They wanted the team to stay. Mm-hmm. And so then we just opened up the rest. We said, that's fine, but let's not get into revenue sharing deals. Let's not cap our economics. Mm-hmm. And it worked out best for both parties. Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. You mentioned also in that discussion that there have been times where people just say, this is my breaking point. This is when I'm going to walk away, and they don't. So it leads me to ask, what role does deception play in negotiations, if any? So, and anyone is free to take that who wants to jump in.
It gets down to your trust and credibility. In most cases in sports, they're not one-off negotiations. It's a relationship-based negotiation. You're going to be seeing that party again a year, 2 years, 3 years down the road. And even if you don't, you're going to be operating with that company. If you reach an agreement, they're going to be your partner for a period of years. And if you conduct yourself poorly in the negotiation and you say you've got everything out of them and more, there's going to be a point in time when you're operating under the deal that something doesn't go wrong, you can't deliver, and they're going to come back and take it out of your hide in a very big way because of the way you conducted yourself during the negotiation. So I've seen situations where ultimatums have been issued and then no, that's not really the deadline. Then you're not going to believe it the next time they tell you that it's truly a deadline. But to your point about deals blowing up, yes, emotion is definitely one of them. But also what we found is at times people try to do what we call retrading a deal. If you've got 10, 12, 15 different deal points and a few are left, and then you go into the next negotiation, I've only got 3 points left, and then you start restating things. No, I never agreed to that. And that's when emotions do come into play, and you're going backwards, and then you just start seeing a deal starting to spin out of control because you've lost the faith, confidence, and trust with the person who's sitting across the table from you.
Brian, I was going to say, this is nothing against agents, but I've got to imagine that dealing with the number of player agents, there's probably a fair amount of, if not deception, gamesmanship.
Yeah, what I would say, especially young people here, if you're going to negotiate player contracts either side, the first thing you need to do is learn to swear fluently, frequently. There are multisyllabic words that are useful as adverbs, adjectives, pronouns, nouns. But I think the deception side of it, it'll only ever work once. And then the GM's we're not going to deal with that agent, or we're going to tell the kid, if we have to deal with this guy, we're going to put the boots to you. We're not going to put the boots to him. We're going to put the boots to you. And so this has happened. I've gone to players and said, I have a problem with your agent. It's not going away. And you're going to pay a price for this if you stick with them. They usually do stick with them. They usually pay a price. That's the loyalty factor that most agents have with their players. But it's the deception part is a real poor strategy because it only works once, if it even works once. And then that guy's dead to me as far as
I would agree with that. In our business, I frequently say that we're in the business of extending our relationships, extending our licenses. And if you are deceiving the other party, you got to understand the leverage in our situation is always going to be with the property holder, the IP holder. They're the ones that choose who to license it to. To deceive them is not a good long-term strategy.
So I hope this is somewhat connected, but deception and the role the media plays, I'd be particularly interested in hearing from you, Brian, because I know that a lot of things, for example, with a trading deadline, float out there, and you have to deal with that, and there's pressures there.
Well, we've been asked to play in the Winter Classic next year in Ann Arbor against the Detroit Red Wings. And as part of that, if HBO revives the 24/7 series, which is absolutely marvelous, we've been asked before if we would do 24/7, and I said, no, we already have it. It's Toronto. The players are, we're surrounded anyhow. So I would never do it. I would never allow that access except as a part of the Winter Classic. But the media in our town, it's really hard to explain. Like to the Dallas Cowboys, that's our daily routine is what probably their game day is like. The number of cameras and reporters at practice, it's maddening, and it makes, I think the trade deadline is just murder on our players, where they're doing for a month in advance, they're speculating on all these guys that could get traded. I think Luke Shen got traded 30 times in the last 2 weeks. He's still on our team. But to the point where I have my own trade deadline around Christmas time. The NHL has a trade deadline, so a player can't get traded at Christmas, and it starts on December 19th. Well, if you've got European players, they've got to book flights sooner than that. So we've always had all my teams in Anaheim, Vancouver. Our trade deadline starts 10 days before that on December 9th. So I don't think players should get traded at Christmas time, and they can make plans for their family and all that. We're debating internally doing the same thing with the trade deadline next year. We had a long discussion about it. It's so hard on our players that we may just say our own internal deadline next year is 2 weeks before the NHL's. And you could always go to a kid that wants out and say, hey, you know, we've announced this publicly, but you're still on the block because you know, it's not working out for you here. But we're debating that seriously. I think it's had a real detrimental impact on our players.
To say, Alec, you know, the Cowboys, though, have a pretty strong media contingent themselves. Any instances where media has impacted or influenced the way in which you go about a negotiation?
Yeah, we've had a couple. We had one instance where the media got a hold of a big business negotiation before it was complete. And I thought that had a detrimental effect. I think just by virtue of it becoming so public, the counterparty realized what they were getting into because we're so public and it became national news. But most of the time people do business with us have an idea that if they do business with us, it's because of our brand and because of the exposure. And I guess going back to the point that Gary's making on transparency, I've noticed recently that there's more and more transparency in negotiations. It's almost like you just say, look, here are my books. This is how well I'm going to do on this deal. This is how well we expect to do. And then the other party can work from that. And it's actually been pretty successful for us. When we book events, when we do deals with people like the NFL, we almost don't try to hide it, but we're also not trying to hide the fact that we'd like to do well on the deal.
I want to talk to you about technology.
Technology.
And how, you know, switching a little bit from media tech to technology, how difficult is it with electronic arts? You know, 9 months from now, there may be 4 different platforms on which your games can be available, but you're negotiating now.
Yeah, I mean, again, I consider that our business is different because it's really a combination of art and technology. I mean, our games exist on dedicated console platforms, high-powered PCs, increasingly now on smartphones, pads, on social networks, in a connected way that we link people all over the world. And what creates the challenge, a lot of the leagues, and I think Gary can probably speak to this, there's a tendency to want to segment the rights, both geographically and in terms of technologies. And it's taken a while for us to work with all of our partners for them to understand that we have to offer a persistent experience, interactive experience across all these various platforms, even if they don't exist at the time that you've done the deal. You're going to want to follow your consumer to like when I did a deal with Gary a couple years ago, it was before there was the iPhone, it was before there was the iPad, and it was before there was Facebook. And one could take the position, well, no, you don't have those rights. That would be harmful to everybody's interest because it's better to follow those consumers and to engage them in your entertainment products in a way that has persistence across your whole franchise. So now, for example, if you play Madden on your iPhone, it actually benefits when you play on your PlayStation 3. And the same is true as Facebook and the other platforms. And I think that I was here during one of the earlier panels when John Skipper referred to the fact that they don't refer to them as televisions or personal computers or smartphones anymore. They're just screens. We're sort of in the same neighborhood. They're just screens, and we have to be able to offer our entertainment across all those screens because that's the way consumers have come to expect it.
Gary, did you want to?
Yeah, we're moving much more in that direction. Historically, we had licensed by platform, and now certainly in our most recent media deals and some other deals that we're working on, we are granting more cross-platform rights. We still have a major agreement with Verizon where they have the rights to cell phones to distribute games and highlights, and we've not merged that into our television deals. But we do look at it on a case-by-case basis, and certainly the way the world is going, you've heard the concept in the television world about television everywhere. That is more and more the way rights are being delivered and consumed by the fans.
Same with us.
Anyone else want to chime in on that? Just in terms of where you do your negotiating, how much of the negotiations take place inside like a formal negotiation room, and how much of it is more informal? You know, particularly in this case, we have a lot of people who have worked together before. I believe the partnership between Gary and Alec has been going on, 13 or so years, and Gary and Joel, you've been negotiating for 10 plus years together. So how much of it is inside and how much outside?
Well, I'm not sure there's a difference. Personally, I don't like to negotiate in a group because that just leads to showmanship that doesn't really advance the cause. It doesn't advance anybody's cause. So again, it depends on the particular deal you're talking about in the particular negotiation and the particular parties, but I prefer to deal one-on-one. I think it's fair to say that most of the negotiations between the NFL and EA are with me and Gary. It's not 100% true, but it's largely true. And I think that's likely the case on a lot of our deals.
We do, having been a team president for a number of years, doing suite agreements, doing licensing deals, doing sponsorship deals, I have found it very useful to concede the turf war up front and go to the other party's office. Like, sports teams generally say, you come to us, we'll do the deal in our boardroom. I find that over the years it's worked wonders to say, I'll come out to your place. And when I got to Vancouver in '98, as a president and GM, many of our suite contracts were up at the same time. They didn't stagger them when they opened the building. And I had to call on and negotiate and close a half dozen suite deals that were at risk. And you know, Vancouver's very successful financially now, but we weren't back then. And I found just the gesture of making the drive out to that guy's office helped. It started the negotiation off, and I do it with player agents too. I'll go to their office to work on a deal, and I find it changes the dynamic if you're off your turf. And then, you know, the only other thing I'd say to people is you get clear instructions from your client what you want. Like, if you're going to represent players, you better, once you put something on the table with me and you've agreed to it, it's done. If it's something you find out later you didn't clear with your client, that's your problem. That isn't my problem now. You've agreed to it. I've agreed to it. We're done here. So I think it's important to get clear instructions up front. Most negotiations take several sessions. Player contract, you usually typically have one big meeting and get all the swearing out of the way. And then there's a series of follow-up phone calls while you work on the particulars, bonus structure, whatever. But you need clear instructions up front, and you need to take good notes because these things take over time. And if you're stuck in a cab, you still got to write down what was agreed to. You confirm it by email. Like, we track that process. We don't trust that negotiation is going to go along smoothly and that parties are going to share agreement. We track that. We send an email after, say, okay, so here are what we've agreed to so far. Here's the bones of the deal. Here's the structural steel of the deal, number of years and term. Now we got to work out the details. And I would never trust the other side to have the same understanding I do. So we do a follow-up on everything. And to me, that's the key: is good notes, good records. The trust issue is key. It's much easier to do a second deal than it is to do the first deal. Our nightmare on the player side is an agent with one client. That's a dangerous agent because he's not trying to get a good deal. He's trying to hit it right out of the park, and it's just a nightmare. I'd much rather have a guy with 30 clients than a guy with one. That guy's got to hit a home run, and it's always unpleasant with him. He's new, doesn't know what he's doing, his comparables aren't right, and it's a very unpleasant first meeting. And so we like these guys are saying, where you have a relationship with guys that have represented players over years, you know they're ethical, it tends to be much smoother. They're not going to ask for anything unrealistic. They're not going to ask for anything they can't back up with a comparable. You know, it is in our industry, there are comparables for every player. And so if you come in and say, this guy's a 20-goal scorer and everyone else's age is making $3 million and you want $4 million, it's going to be a short meeting. The answer is going to be no, we're not doing that. Where are your comparables? So I think note-taking is important. I think trust is important. But to me, you should never take that to chance. That's something you can control. The other side's knowledge of what they've agreed to, you can confirm that as you move forward. So that's how we do it. But going to the other party's office, to me, has made a huge difference over the years.
Alec, did you have something you wanted
Yeah,
to?
I think Brian hit it on the head, right? You need to know, you need to trust the other party has authority, and then you need to know that they're sophisticated. Without those two things, the deal can go by the wayside. And so even though Gary works for the NFL, and then the NFL reports up to the commissioner, and there's 31 other clubs, when you deal with Gary, you know that he's already cleared what he's given. And that's critical, because if not, you can spend tons of your time spinning your wheels, then you go back and Gary says, I'm sorry, that wasn't acceptable to everyone else. Another thing, of course, is that Gary knows what he's doing. And so I used to think that makes for
Can
a
you
tougher...
write my review?
Yeah, I'm doing it right now. It's on tape. We're going to send it in. I used to think that made for tougher negotiations, but I've realized over time that it's much easier to cut to the chase when both parties know what they're doing. You might spend a little time gaining advantages here. For every advantage, when you're dealing with an unsophisticated party, they're going to take 3 or 4 away from you, and it'll just take longer.
So
And
you're-
if a guy ever says he needs to get authority, then tell him to get the right people in the room. If you're in a negotiation, the guy says, I got to get authority for this, then why am I sitting down with you? Whoever you're going to call, get him in here now, or get her in here now. Not doing this two-stage thing. Get the right people in the room, or get the right instructions, or get the hell out of the room.
One thing that I've observed, and it's very surprising, is how underprepared certain people are when they go into a negotiation. Sometimes they go in with just their next move, and negotiations are fluid. You need to be thinking 3-4 steps ahead, and they've only come to the next meeting prepared to move up a little, and you may throw them another suggestion, a concept, and they're just not prepared, to deal with it. So to Brian's point, then you're really not dealing with someone that is in a position to make a deal. They really should bring in somebody who is much more adept at doing these sort of things. But I, like others here, I used to think it was easier to take advantage of someone and get a great deal done because they don't know what they're doing. At times at the NFL, we've been able to do that, but it really comes back to bite us because within 6 months of the deal, a year deal, this senior management that's very unhappy with the person you cut the deal with, and the attorney or whoever's negotiating the deal is heading for the hills and no longer working there, and you've got a messy situation to clean up.
A lopsided deal, too. Like, if you skin a GM in a deal, that's the last deal you're going to make with that GM. You're better off trying to make deals that work for both teams. And in terms of business deals, you make too strong a deal, it's going to end up in bankruptcy. And I remember years ago a team telling me that they just made a new deal with their American League affiliate, and it was the best deal in the history of the NHL. And when the guy went on and outlined it, I said, 18 months. He said, what? I said, 18 months. That team's going to be in bankruptcy, and you're going to be looking for a new farm team. That's it didn't even take 18 months. So you drive too hard a bargain, at some point it's going to bite you right in the ass.
Okay.
There's a connection here to analytics as well. I've consulted with organizations doing negotiation, working numbers very hard, intensively, well, but right up until the beginning of the negotiation. The last time I sat in with this organization in particular, 2 minutes before they're going to start the negotiation, they've just spent 25 summarizing the numbers that they spent months building. 25 minutes summarizing the numbers, and the last 5 minutes they say, okay, what's our negotiation strategy? And we laugh, but you've probably all, if you run numbers, you've been in that situation where you focus so much on getting the numbers right that you don't get past the numbers, and you need to get past the numbers. And you want the analysis to be there to help you, but you have to go past the analysis.
Brian, I just wanted to follow up on one thing you said about it being a pain in the ass to negotiate with the agent who has one client. What is the strategy you employ when you have that agent come across and who has that one client and he's trying to hit a home run from it?
Well, my theory is make the first meeting as short and unpleasant as possible. So that it's your only chance for the guy, unless it's like other people would try to reason with a guy. Sometimes it's better to punch someone in the face. We're not doing that. You don't know what you're doing. Come back with real numbers, or I'm going to sit down with your client, and you'll be with 0 clients. So it's not. It is truly a nightmare. A guy with 3 or 4 clients is a dangerous guy.
Jerry Maguire, right?
Jerry Maguire.
I guess I want to turn it over shortly to student and audience questions, but before we do it, I'd be curious to know from all the panelists how you negotiate on your own behalf. So whether it's a contract you have to negotiate, or you're buying a house, or some other service or product, are the strategies the same, or are you a different person when you're negotiating on your own behalf? And I guess we can easily go from left to right.
I guess that's me.
Yes, Joel, sorry.
There's a difference when you're negotiating, trying to buy a car or a house for yourself, or you're negotiating in business. As I said, in business, our job is to extend our relationships. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not a win-lose. We try and make it win-win. We try and align interests. But generally speaking, to answer your question, because I know that was a bit evasive, to answer the question, my approach is the same. When I am working on behalf of Electronic Arts, I am generally looking for what I believe is a fair result, as opposed to one where we just win. And when I'm negotiating on my own behalf, I generally am looking for a fair result, as opposed to trying to get that last $300 from the car dealership. That's where I am.
Gary?
Well, when it comes to negotiations with my family members, I always lose, and that's intentional. Keep a good relationship, but in terms of personal relation. I remember we did a home renovation a number of years ago, and my wife gives me this contract, and it had to be the most one-sided contract I've ever read. It was out of the architect's book. And I said, we can't sign this. She said, well, what do you mean? I said, well, let me just make some suggestions. We went out and negotiated with the architect. She says, you're the first person that's ever tried to negotiate this for me before. I said, all right, maybe it's a lawyer in me. And fortunately, I didn't push as hard as I would have liked to have, because this is going to be the architect for the only home that I was living in. But we did get the points across. And to Joel's point, I'm generally not going to push as hard on personal things as I would, from a business standpoint.
I try to be a prick all the time.
That's the quote of the day. Everyone can leave now.
How am I going to top that?
I know. Maybe we should just go to questions.
Thanks, Brian. I just try to use the same techniques that I use in business. We just bought a home last year, and I found that my real estate broker didn't know what he was doing, and I found that the seller's real estate broker didn't know what she was doing. So I just took matters into my own hands. I typed up a memo. I did the comp work. I looked around and said, these are the right comps, not the ones the brokers are saying. And once we got the middlemen out of the way, we got the deal done.
The agents.
I think the main thing I do differently now over the years is to try to be more creative, to hold out for good deals, and if you can't get to a good deal, then find out a creative way to get there. So all the big negotiations in my life the last few years, whether it's with schools or houses or deans, they've always gotten us to a stuck place, and then we get past the stuck place by being creative, by doing something different, doing something that hasn't been done before, relaxing some assumption, going to left field, but not giving up on the deal, not settling for a bad deal, but being more creative to get a good deal done.
I really want to jump on that point, because that seems like a key to negotiations, is the creativity. And I think you were hinting at that before, Alec, with the mental agility aspect of deals. I mean, how valuable is just the creative aspect of deal making? Some people, I think you go in with a set plan, but just that ability to do your own thing or freelance a little bit once you're in the room.
Well, you're trying to get to a point where you could reach compromises, and if you're not creative, you throw out your first one or two, and if it doesn't work, then you're just staring at each other and you're not making any progress. So you're really trying to find a way for your counterparty to say yes. And the other thing, which we may not have touched on earlier, is a lot of people have to report to somebody else. In Ryan's case, the agent's reporting to the player. How is that person going to convince a player that that's a good deal when that's not what he or she was prepared to agree to before? And we look at it in the corporate standpoint, the people we're negotiating with, sometimes it's the CEO, but oftentimes it's not. How do they get the authority, and how do they look good going in? Because no one wants to go back, look bloody, and say, I'm sorry, this is all I could do. You got to make the person look good at some point in the negotiation, otherwise it's not going to be a good deal.
I think a good deal, when you look back on it, someone who didn't know the deal would say, why do you have those provisions in the deal? And that shows that you were creative in the deal. If you look at our latest merchandising deal with the NFL, there are all kinds of things that weren't in the first one. And those were just instances where we had hit roadblocks and we figured out ways around those. Figured out what the NFL wanted, and we gave certain credits in one area or certain reimbursements in another area.
Brian, there's got to be some creativity in your deal making.
Well, standard players contract, you're just negotiating just a couple of terms. So the player side, there is no creativity. It's not even permitted. And so, but on the sponsorship side, I agree with that. Like we've reached out to, in Vancouver years ago, we made a deal with a chain of movie theaters to show our playoff games in the movie theater. We actually made a nice little chunk of money off that for a couple of years. We were the first team to do it in hockey. I don't know about the other sports, but and it was a guy on our staff said he was at the movies and it hit him. And he says to me the next day, we ought to show these games in the movie theater. So we did. We made a nice chunk of money off it. We had, talk about creativity, the best ice in the NHL is in Edmonton. And I always thought it's because you could just open the doors in the middle of winter, but it turns out the water that they used was composed of a certain amount of limestone and different elements. Well, we had the water analyzed, and we started selling that compound in Vancouver. And a nice little business selling the chemical compounds that were in the water in Edmonton to other arenas. And you can treat your water with these chemicals and have better ice. We actually made a nice little chunk of money on that too. So I think being creative is, we've found travel components we can sell where if we're the only people in town that can sell a road trip with the Toronto Maple Leafs and include the tickets and transportation, that has value. So I agree with that. I think creativity is a key. And I think that in terms of making a deal, once you're stuck and there's a gap, it's really the only way to resolve it is either to cave or be creative. And since we're not much on caving, that's what we try to do. It's, well, what if this did happen? So the guy says, well, we're going to pay you this, and that's all we're going to pay. Well, what if your sales increase so much? Then what's it worth to you? Well, then it's worth more. Okay, let's figure out a way. So you do a tiered deal with a basic guarantee. Sales exceed a certain number, it's X. Sales exceed a certain number, it's Y. So I think creativity on the sponsorship, building, lease side, all of those areas is essential. It's not particularly useful with player contracts.
And on that note, turn it over to audience questions. I'm a little stuck. Okay, we'll start off here. This is from a text. It says 4 panelists have law degrees. In opening the panel, Rob Manfred said lawyers today take a back seat in negotiations to the numbers guys. Thoughts, lawyers? And no.
I was at that session. Rob and I happened to have graduated from the same school, Cornell, in the same year, and both lawyers. I don't think Rob said the lawyers take a back seat. I think he said that the financial modeling, the analytics have become much more important. And I think we've all indicated that that is true in the last 7 to 10 years in our negotiations. So I think having a law degree is excellent training. It gives you a way to look at things analytically. The preparation we talked about, we haven't really touched on the ability to persuade someone. That's part of, it's not necessarily advocacy, but you're having a discussion, trying to bring someone to your point of view and have them agree with your position. I think those are all very good skills. That's not to say that someone who is an MBA and is more quantitatively oriented can't be a good negotiator, and there are plenty of people who fall into that
I actually
category.
think the only advantage, there's actually 2 advantages. Gary just referred to one of them. I also have a law degree, but I don't believe I function as a lawyer when I'm negotiating on behalf of Electronic Arts. I actually leave a lot of the legal stuff to the what I call the lawyers. They work for me, but I don't consider myself one of them when I'm negotiating with the NFL or the NBA or the Premier League or whomever it may be. What a legal education teaches you is the limits of a contract and the limits of being able to draft to every possibility. And that enters into some of the themes that you've heard here. There's got to be a certain level of trust. There's got to be a certain sort of custom and practice because, if you're pulling out the contract every 2 weeks, say, what does it provide? That's not a successful relationship, and it's not one that's doomed, it's not one that's destined to live for a long time.
Yeah, there's no, I guess the way I say it, you don't turn off your lawyer and you don't turn on your business person. If you have a negotiation where you spend most of your time on legal provisions, it's a negotiation that's going nowhere. And I learned, the person I worked for at the law firm, he was at a law firm, he was a partner at a law firm, he spent no time negotiating the legal provisions. Because if you can't get the business deal right, then you don't have to worry about the indemnification and things like that. And so I think that's kind of where this is headed. I think it's probably always been that way for lawyers. If you can't get a sense of what the business deal is, then you're always going to be just the person who's looking at the indemnification provision.
Well, I hated law school, so. But I think the degree is useful. I think it teaches you a linear approach to everything. It's okay, we're here, we need to get there, how do we do it? And the capacity for lawyers to work hard and get around issues and spend the time is amazing. You watch them in collective bargaining, they can go around the clock, these guys. They are tireless. They're warriors. And that part I like about the law degree, but I didn't particularly enjoy law school.
Kate, any insights you want to share from the
Numbers don't negotiate for themselves, and you've got to have someone who knows what to do with numbers. So Alec works a lot with numbers in his negotiations. He's not an analyst, but he can use the numbers. The numbers by themselves aren't going to do anything for you.
And Alec, this one comes for you, but anyone can chime in here. It says, you mentioned transparency. Does transparency always help? And I guess, or are there pitfalls to transparency as
Oh,
well?
there definitely are pitfalls. I mean, I don't think, you can't be 100% transparent, right? It's a spectrum, and you can't tell someone exactly what you're getting out of a deal. And you don't expect that from the other side. But what you can do is go farther down the spectrum than you have if you have confidence in your position. And you just have to be honest about your position. You might be transparent about what you want, but say, I'm not going to be totally transparent about how much we're going to make off of this deal, right? But look, we assume when we do an event deal in our stadium, we'd like to make over $500,000. That's what it's worth it to us to have a big event. Otherwise, it's not worth it. Now, I don't have to say we'd like to make $512,000, but then they have a pretty good idea. We don't have to go all the way. But I do think that over time, you move in that direction with sophisticated people on the other side, because you know that they have an idea of why you're doing the deal.
Anyone else want to share any thoughts about benefits or pitfalls of transparency in action?
That's about right for me.
Let's see here. This one comes, this is for everyone on the panel. What contracts would you love to negotiate?
So it just shows you grass is always greener. I'd love to have Brian's job.
Why?
I think that'd be really interesting to deal with the players and I deal with businesses, but dealing with individuals and their production is out there on the ice or on the field or on the court for all to see, and how executives value that and how they build a team in the future. Since somebody asked the question, that would be my answer.
Yeah, my job's a goddamn howl right now. Boy, do I feel lucky.
And this one I think is directed to Brian. So what data stats, if any, do players and agents bring to the negotiating table?
Player stats?
No, what data, statistics in general, any metrics do players and their agents or their agents bring to the negotiating table?
It is truly the historical Boston Globe data. It's time on ice, face-off percentage, shots, shooting percentage, goals, assists, penalty minutes. There is no, our negotiations are based almost exclusively on the same data that we've used for 50 years to negotiate or 100 years to negotiate player contracts. The pressure points come when the player's status changes with regard to free agency. That's when the player gets the hammer back, and it's basically, you've got to figure out what he could command on the open market and what that cost is to you if you lose that player, and figure out what to pay him. But the data doesn't change, the statistics don't change. What changes in a negotiation for a player is, as he goes through his career, his leverage increases dramatically. And the average career in our league is about 3 years. That's what the data says. But if you play 3 years, I think your average career, it's like the NFL. I think the average career they say is 3.4 years. But if you play 3.4 years, the average career is something like 8 years. So that player, if he's a 10-year player, he's going to get to unrestricted free agency at some point. If he's still a productive asset, you're going to pay him. Whether you want to or not, you're going to pay him. Or you're going to make the value judgment, let him walk, take that cash and spend it on a different player. But you're going to pay somebody at some point for that player's success.
The next question is, who is the best negotiator you've ever worked with or known? I know this presents some interesting issues since 3 of the panelists here negotiate with themselves, or amongst themselves. So, but anyone want to take a stab at that? Who's the best negotiator? And it says also, and the worst negotiator you've ever worked with. I don't know if people want to be
I don't think you're getting answers on that one.
that
No.
revealing.
I'll give those guys a moment to think about an answer. I'll give you one example. I taught at Yale for 6 years with a colleague, Barry Nailbuff, who's an economist and a game theorist. And I learned a lot about negotiation from him. He recently consulted to the NBA during the CBA negotiations. And I thought they couldn't have chosen a better person in the world to be a consultant. And I mentioned the creativity thing before. He's one of the main reasons I've learned to be more creative in my negotiations, because he's not only super smart, he's extremely creative. So that's an easy answer for me. These guys, some of them know him.
Best I've seen is Gary Bettman.
What does he do that's...
Well, we talk about you're in a room full of smart people. There's smart and then there's Bettman smart. That's a term we actually used when I worked at the league. He's a really bright guy and really quick on his feet. Very 3 steps ahead type guy. He's, I actually had to ask him to slow down a few times when we were doing the CBA back in '94 because he's getting ahead of all of us talking to himself in the room. Well, this won't work because no, and then in 3 years, huh? So I think it's a combination of, it starts with real high IQ and a practical guy and a good guy. He's not but I've watched him and marveled at his ability.
I'll give a politically correct, and it's good for my career, but it's actually a true answer, Roger Goodell. I've worked with him in a lot of negotiations, and he's really terrific.
Elaborate on really terrific.
Yeah, that sounded like it was just for your career.
I was waiting for the follow-up question. Come on. Shira's
There you
good.
have it. Elaborate on really terrific.
He is very good at distilling very complex information. He's firm in the position. He's credible in terms of presenting the information to the other party, and just has a very good way about getting the other side to agree without making the other side feel that, I've got no choice. It's the NFL's rights, and it's your way or the highway.
Alex?
So I'm going to say
I
Jerry.
was gonna say,
I
you're
got to
going
say
with
Jerry
Jerry.
now. But I will say this. Actually, Jerry has one talent when it comes to negotiating, which is amazing. He'll ask questions no one else asks. And he consistently does this. And the first time he asks you this question, when you're in the middle of a negotiation, you're like, where is that question coming from? It makes no sense. And then you realize that he thought of something that no one else had thought of. And he did this when it came to NFL marketing rights for clubs. He did it when it came to our merchandising deal. He's the first one who thought, why can't a club do its own merchandising? He's the first one who really pushed the issue, why don't clubs control their marks in their territories? And so I think that's a gift, right? I mean, there are a lot of people who are good day-to-day negotiators, but his vision is amazing. He kind of pushes you towards these things that normal people don't think of.
We might all agree it's Franklin Court in the next month.
And Joel?
Yeah, actually, I don't have a name to give you because I actually think the best negotiators I've ever dealt with are actually mediators. I practiced law. I litigated cases for for much longer time than I've been at Electronic Arts. And I marveled sometimes at the way a mediator could actually take 2 warring parties. That's not people that have an intention to do business together or even necessarily want to do. Almost want to kill each other and get them to agree on a structure. And there's a number of them, but they wouldn't mean anything to anybody here.
I think we're at time, basically. We've got 1 minute left, and we are through with audience questions, so I'll take this time to thank the panelists and thank the audience, and thank Jessica and Daryl and everyone who's hosted us here for the conference.